my name is Mahid Jamaldeen, and I am an Associate Director with Deloitte Access Economics. And we are the economics practice within Deloitte, and we're based in Australia. So before we begin proceedings today, so typically in Australia, when we do anything really, we like to acknowledge traditional owners of the land on which we meet. As some of you might already know, the traditional custodians of this land in Australia is the Aboriginal people, the Indigenous people of Australia, and they are the longest, most enduring culture in all of humanity and all of human history. So we are very proud of that. The longest continuing culture of 60,000 plus years. So we wanted to acknowledge their continuing connection to land, country, and acknowledge the fact that Nick Hull, who will be presenting part of today's session, Eamon McGinn, and myself are on Gadigal country of the Eora Nation, and we pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So as I said, my name is Mahid Jamaldeen, and I'll talk you through, I'll provide a bit of an introduction as to what we will be talking about today, and then I'll hand over to Eamon McGinn. Secondly, he'll do a bit of introduction about himself, and then he'll take you through one of our sections and a few fun activities for all the attendees here. And then I'll hand over to Nick Hull after that. So a bit about Deloitte Access Economics. We are proudly economists and united by a passion for economics. And the good thing about Deloitte Access Economics is that we believe that economics is a force for good. It's just not just about financial markets and stock market prices going up and down. We believe in the power of economics for creating a better future for all. And Deloitte Access Economics offers a full suite of macroeconomic and microeconomic services. So that includes things like natural disaster mitigation strategies, understanding the economics of natural disasters, and in particular how climate change impacts on natural disasters as well. So today's presentation is focused on a few different studies we've done since about 2013. And up there on the website, you can see the range of studies we've done. Up there on the slides, you can see the range of studies we've done. And for today's session, we wanted to focus on how you can use economics and how you can use a cost and benefit framework to understand what impacts natural disasters have, not just on insured losses. That's typically what people think about when it comes to natural disasters. What's the insurance cost? Our approach takes it beyond that. So we think about the costs not just in terms of insurance, but also in terms of tangible, intangible costs. What does it mean for cleanup costs? What does it mean for mental health costs? So we take a more holistic approach, and that comes out of utilizing several economic tools at our disposal. So we'll talk a bit about that today. And ultimately, the benefit of this approach is that you can really bring together a more systematic view to how you can create more resilience within the economy and society to natural disasters. So in Australia, Australia's a big place. If you've ever looked at Australia on a map, it's a pretty dry place. It's a big place. Our population is about 25 million, so that's minuscule compared to some of the great nations around the world. And we are not spared in terms of the impact of natural disasters. Just a few that we've noted there on the slide. In Victoria, which is where Melbourne is, we unfortunately experienced the Black Saturday bushfires in 2009. There were nearly 200 fatalities there. Then Brisbane, for those of you who watch the cricket, that's where the Gabba is. And cricket is a sport. For those of you who are not from Commonwealth countries, cricket is a sport, a bat and ball sport. that's the main cricketing ground in Brisbane. So in Brisbane, there were floods. There were terrible floods, which resulted in nearly $2.5 billion in insured losses, and that's just the insurance loss. There were many more losses beyond that, and that's what we'll be talking about today. And again, Queensland, which is further north in Australia, so therefore has a more tropical, temperate climate, and that means that it's susceptible to things like cyclones as well. So that Cyclone Debbie also caused significant impact to Queensland. And of course, the last one there, the Black Summer bushfires, which happened in this time last year, they were terrible. And my colleagues here, Eamon, Nick, and I, even though we live in Sydney and we work in Sydney, and even for us, there was a significant impact in terms of just coming on our way to coming into the office. The air quality was significantly deteriorated, and it was honestly I had the pleasure of looking at the rankings in terms of air quality during the bushfires, and it was really terrible. And we were up there with, as the worst city in the world with the worst air quality at that point in time. So as I flagged just earlier, we'll be talking about not just insured losses, we'll be expanding it beyond that. We'll be talking about direct tangible costs, indirect tangible costs, and intangible costs. And just to set the scene, it's important, as I said earlier, to look at not just insured costs. It's important to look beyond that in order to then bring together government, civil society, private sector to understand that natural disasters have systemic effects and that go beyond just the insurance sector. And bringing that lens, we believe, has the benefit of adopting a more holistic approach to respond to natural disasters and think about resilience in a more productive and holistic manner. So I'll stop right there and I'll hand over to my colleague Eamon McGinn, and he'll talk through this section.
All right. Excellent. Thank you, Mahid. Okay, there we go. We should have fixed that feedback problem there. Thanks, Mahid. Thanks, Nick. We've used the same core approach across all of those 5 reports to trying to value the costs of natural disasters. And this is basically it up on the screen here. So I guess it's not overly complicated, this framework. It's just breaking down the overall cost of natural disasters into manageable pieces that we can work through and put actual numbers against. So we break it down into, we start with the insured losses and the uninsured losses. So those are the direct damage that's done to buildings, businesses, that sort of thing. Then we add in the public infrastructure damage costs. So that's destruction to things like roads, bridges, waterways that are owned by the government. Then we add in business disruption costs. So those are the business interruption type costs. We add in lost agricultural production, a range of emergency response costs. So that's both, you can think government emergency response costs like firefighters or the state emergency service that we have here who come and clean up after disasters. We add in personal cleanup costs, particularly important for things like flood and storm. We add in evacuation costs, so the costs of leaving home and staying elsewhere for a number of nights, as well as the temporary housing cost involved there too. Then, so I guess we've been moving up the chain of things that are a little bit more abstract, and now we start to move into the much harder to quantify costs of natural disasters. So we quantify the cost of fatalities and injuries. Those are at least measurable in terms of the number of fatalities and injuries, but putting a dollar term on them is always challenging. And then in the more recent reports, we've moved into the more challenging areas of mental health costs, chronic disease, and alcohol misuse, as well as family violence. So those more social costs associated with the natural disasters. So happy to take questions later on about any of those particular, cost items. I think we might move into like how to apply it, because that's a bit more interesting than how we, sum up what those costs are. But I'll stay on the last slide for one more sec, Nick. I was just going to say that the other thing I want to draw your attention to are those dashed boxes. So there are obviously a whole range of costs associated with natural disasters that we haven't quantified. This doesn't mean they're not real and we don't recognize them. It just means either A, we haven't gotten there yet, or B, the data or information isn't solid enough for us to quantify them yet. But we do have those on an aspirational list, I think, to get to a fuller picture of what the cost of natural disasters is. So we were going to use breakout rooms. I think we don't have a whole heap of people in the room, so we might just stay all together in one room. So if you go to the next slide, Nick, we do have a Menti poll as well. So you might have to, if you bring that up on your screen, Nick, I think we might be able to hopefully see what the results are. But basically what we were hoping to have a little bit of a talk around and get people's feel for was which of those components of the natural disaster costs you might think will be the largest. Like, what's your gut feel? I'll see if anybody's brave enough to chip in their thoughts on which will be the largest portion of the costs. Okay, so if you go to menti.com and use that code up at the top of the screen, 7354825, you should be able to go in and have a look and have a vote at what you think might be the largest portion of the natural disaster costs, and we can see what the kind of feel of the room looks like. I'm going to have a go in there now, and I'll put in my little guess. 5. Okay, here we go. So while we're waiting for some votes to come in, I guess was there anybody on the call who had some thoughts around which component of the cost might be the largest in their expectation or experience? All right. Having a bit of trouble with Menti, but that's okay. We'll come back. We'll get it next time. We'll have another little vote to come through. So I'll go back to the presentation. Nick, if you want to do it that way. Okay, there we go. So it is actually the mental health, particularly psychological distress costs that are the largest. So here we've done, these are 3 bottom-up, built-up case studies of how to estimate the cost of natural disasters, a storm event, a fire event, and a flood event. These are modelled around some significant storms that happened in New South Wales, in northern New South Wales. This is the Victorian bushfire event that Mahid spoke about, and this is the Queensland flood event that was on that slide as well. And it looks as if, the insured costs are nothing to ignore, and the public assets are quite significant as well, but it is those social costs, the mental health, the alcohol and drug use, and the chronic disease and family violence that are the biggest component in these major events like flood and fire, which is, I guess, to a hard-nosed economist, a little bit of a surprise, but to any normal person, I'm sure they would think that that's not too far out of the ordinary. So we'll move on to how these can be used. So when we've got that framework of breaking down the costs and building them back up again to come up with a full number. So that's a useful approach just in terms of quantifying the overall costs of natural disasters to your country or your state or what have you. That was that headline number of, I think, $39 billion annual cost of natural disasters in Australia. That's been a very useful number for both industry and government to know, because it helps put it in the context of other things that industry and government think about. But I think the kind of more practical use for this type of analysis is thinking about investments to enhance resilience. So resilience to natural disasters, there's a whole range of investments that could be made, running from hard infrastructure investments through to social and community type approaches to building more resilient communities and societies. So how do we put all those on the one page and choose which path to go down? Well, this approach to quantifying the cost of natural disasters can help significantly. So in that series of reports, we've gone through I think each report features a couple of case studies, and we've gone through and looked at costs and benefits of different approaches to enhancing resilience and reducing the impact of natural disasters. I've gone through and picked out a few here. So we've got a flood levy upgrade. So this is a pretty standard approach to reducing the impact of flood. This was in a major city in northern New South Wales. A bridge duplication. So this was around when you're dealing with flood. This is a town or a city that's split on two sides of a river that floods fairly frequently. And so this is looking at the benefits of duplicating a bridge to help that community stay connected. Then we've got a third, this is actually a really big case study that we looked into, is an electricity line upgrade. So this was looking into the fact that in Australia, a good proportion of the bushfires are started by shorts on transmission electricity lines. And although it's unusual, there's some ability to put these underground, and that would potentially significantly reduce the actual instance of bushfires igniting. And the last one we looked at was vegetation management. So this is the physical removal of trees around houses and buildings in outer Melbourne, which is a high bushfire danger zone, as we saw on Black Saturday. So I think we've got another Menti question here, and hopefully this time it'll work good. So I can see on my Menti screen now, if I go to menti.com and type in that code, I can see our case studies there. And we just wanted you to have a think about which case study gives you the biggest bang for your buck. Don't mind whether you think about that in terms of, is it the cheapest, does it have the most benefits, or what have you. Just your personal thoughts on which is the biggest bang for your buck there. I'm going to put in my vote now. Let's see, what am I going to vote for, Nick? There we go. There we go. So, and happy while people are doing that, if people have any thoughts on those case studies or questions about them, or ideas on which might be the most beneficial, happy to hear from you as well. All right. Nice one. Okay. So we had biggest bang for your buck. Most popular choice was the electricity line upgrade, followed by flood levy and vegetation management, tied for second, and bridge duplication coming in a humble fourth. So let's go back to our slides and let's have a look at what we had at the end of the day. So when we went through and applied our framework, I think one of the interesting things about this is it does throw up some unexpected results from time to time. So the flood levy was actually the cheapest. This is probably because it was an upgrade to an already existing levy. So a lot of the groundwork was already there. It had modest benefits, so it was cost beneficial. It paid for itself, but you know, if a benefit of $15 million isn't huge, you can think of that because it's kind of extending the protection from, say, a 1 in 20 year flood to a 1 in 100 year flood. If we look at vegetation management, that has the biggest benefit that we estimated, so $600 million in benefits. Part of that is due to the fact that this intervention was in a highly populated area, the outskirts of Melbourne, that is also a very high risk of bushfires. So, and there is evidence that pushing back vegetation a relatively small amount can have big benefits in Australia. And so the benefits there were quite significant, $600 million, but the cost itself was very, very large as well, $500 million. This is a highly labor-intensive approach to enhancing resilience. We have to go out and manually chop down or prune back a range of trees. It was the Humble Bridge upgrade that actually has the biggest benefit cost ratio, which is in economics what we think of as a pretty good way of choosing which project gets to go first. So this is a very unglamorous project to duplicate a bridge in a regional town, but the cost is pretty small and the benefits are quite significant. And those benefits are mostly coming from enhanced connectivity across the city. So you can think of in your day-to-day life after the flood clears at this point where we are in Wagga Wagga, it can take a number of days for that city to become reconnected again. And that disturbs a lot of economic activity, a lot of people's lives, a lot of social gatherings, as well as reducing the ability to do critical things like have ambulances moving around, have the state emergency service moving around as well. So that intervention, although not glamorous, actually has the biggest cost benefit ratio. I'll say for the electricity line upgrade that the numbers there don't do it quite justice because that is actually the benefit per event. This one is a little bit hard to judge how many bushfires it would actually prevent. But basically what we found there is if you did this undergrounding work, if you were able to prevent one significant bushfire in the area, it would basically pay for itself. So it's probably, even though it costs a lot of money, it's probably a good thing to be doing. So we'll jump on to the next slide. Well, this is back to you, Nick, yes, to take us through the last section. No problem.
It helps if I unmute. So for the last section that we have for this presentation, we're discussing the challenges in practice, and this relates to some of the modelling challenges, but also in affecting change in how natural disasters are approached and the importance of resilience as well. So what you can see here is a number of the challenges that we have in actually quantifying those costs that we've come up with. And of course, thinking back to that original slide with the list of the number of different costs and different categories, there are some missing data and there's difficulty in quantifying all those different types of costs, particularly by their very nature, the intangible costs are quite difficult, such as loss of social cohesion and other sort of crime-related costs as well. Thinking more broadly about our approach, the approach relies particularly on the use of historical reference events. So the cost breakdowns that we have are based on those three events in terms of storm, the bushfire, and the Queensland floods. And we apply similar ratios for when there are similarities between events. Say for flooding events, the ratios are the same for tropical cyclones as well. So the issue that comes from using historical events, obviously, is that you're relying on the history being the best predictor of the future. And there are reasons why this will not hold in practice or might not hold in practice, and it requires some assumptions. The first point that we have on the list on the left-hand side is around climate change and changing the disaster intensity or the frequency. So while we can, one of the projects that Eamon, Mahid and I are working on is actually seeing what we can do to model the different effects of climate change. And what that brings is basically increasing the frequency of these natural disaster losses, or the insured losses, from which we can estimate the other types of losses using a ratio approach. But what that fails to capture, or it's difficult to capture, is thinking about the impacts that might happen as climate change increases the frequency of these natural disaster events. There might be some sort of interaction effect in terms of, if there's a flooding event at the first half of the year and there is a bushfire event, in the second half of the year, the additional, basically the interaction between those two natural disasters occurring at the same similar time might mean they are greater than the sum of their parts. Also, looking at historical events, the fact that they could happen outside in regional or remote locations, or different locations to the historical events, might mean that they're not the best predictors of future events. Similar with predicting future changes in housing density. And also an important one is, and quite an uncertain one to model, is resilience in dwellings and public infrastructure. Capturing that over a long period, because we were modelling from 2020 to 2050 or 2060. That change can be sporadic. It can be different for different types of natural disasters, and that might have a varying impact on the amount of damage that is caused and the different types of costs that are incurred as well. So, and then lastly, of course, the data availability problem is always going to be a perennial one. But we do believe that our approach has merit. It has really put into focus some of the broader range of costs that occur from natural disaster events. And for that reason, we really want to make sure that it's not just a academic economics research piece, but something that gets put into practice. That is difficult to do in terms of changing the discourse around natural disasters. So you can see here three instances of that. Firstly, we note that there's only 3 out of 12 CBA guidelines for different jurisdictions in Australia that actually contain references to natural disasters or building resilience in investment proposals. And funnily enough, those 3 jurisdictions are the 3 states that usually get hit the hardest in terms of natural disasters, being Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. Then the second piece of evidence we have is a Productivity Commission report. And for those of you unfamiliar with Australia's policy landscape, the Productivity Commission is a sort of principal reviewer of the government's microeconomic policy and provides independent advice. And what this report found was that the changes to natural disaster funding are quite slow and inconsistent across the different jurisdictions. And it highly recommended that basically that investment resilience was considered and made a priority as well, looking beyond just recovery and rebuilding costs as well. More recently, we've had the Royal Commission into the National Natural Disasters Arrangements report, and that focused heavily on the Black Summer bushfires as well. That again mainly focused on improving the management of the emergency response. While mentions were made of resilience, it wasn't the main focus. And looking in terms of the case studies that Eamon presented and spoke about, we think this could be a really important piece that needs to be continually made in this sort of public discourse. So while the story isn't ending, and it's at the moment it's not a complete fate or anything like that, we think it's an important part of an ongoing discourse, and we need to keep using these different costing approaches, recognising broader costing approaches to make sure that this important feature of natural disaster policy is considered. Okay. And I'll just go on mute, but I'll open up the floor to any sort of questions or discussion points that any of the participants would like to raise.
All right, thanks, Nick. Thanks, Nick. There we go. Yeah, I think the main point from that last slide is that it's slow going, but we think there is going to be had from this sort of approach. So yeah, we get a lot of positive feedback around it, and it appeals to industry and to government, and that's an important thing. Just throwing back to the I think very first slide Mahid spoke about, which was the 5 public-facing reports that we've got. Those were commissioned by the Australian Business Roundtable for Disaster Resilience and Sustainable Communities, which is actually a group of, I think it's around, it varies in numbers, but it's normally around 5 private sector businesses who have come together to try and build up the evidence base to help government make these decisions around resilience. And so we're very glad to have been able to work with them for the last 7 years or so on these reports. But yeah, happy to take any questions. I've got a Dorothy Dixer for Mahid if we don't have any questions from the floor straight away, but I'll give you a moment to chime in if there is one. All right, so my question for Mahid is, so Mahid actually joined us from our Commonwealth Government Treasury Department. So that's the, for the Australian government, that's the part of the government that deals with budgets and control of the money and all those sorts of things. So I was wondering, from that point of view, from the Treasury point of view, how these natural disasters and resilience are thought about in Australia from your recollections, like whether they were, front of mind, never thought about. Was there that cost benefit type approach ever mentioned? I'll go on mute now.
Thanks, Eamon. Terrific question, as always. So the short answer to it is that the Treasury and the central government, the Australian government or the Commonwealth government in Australia, as it's called, typically don't seem to think much about natural disasters. And natural disasters, so think your floods, your bushfire, all of that is typically considered a state government responsibility. So in New South Wales, in Australia, for those of you on the call who are not from Australia, Australia has a number of states and territories. And for example, Sydney, the commercial capital of Australia, sits inside New South Wales. So New South Wales has its own government, that's called a state government. And there's a collection of state governments and territory governments, as they're called, and they all sit under the Australian government, which is the central government. So one of the challenges, I think, is that because in Australia you have central government and you have state government, and then within a state you have local governments as well. The three-tier system in Australia means that the federal government, who I used to work for before, and who basically controls the main bucket of funding and tax revenue across the whole country, they don't really think about natural disasters in a systematic fashion. So, for example, when it comes to developing what's called the federal budget, so annually, every year, the government issues a budget saying, okay, this is how much money we're going to raise in terms of taxes, this is how much money we're going to spend. Now, the problem with that is if you don't really think about natural disasters and what it might mean for the budget, you really are missing a big part of the economy and a big part of society. So I think that's a real shortcoming. And the main area that I have seen, there's probably two main areas where I have seen, in my experience, the federal government think about natural disasters is one, what does it mean for GDP forecasts? So typically that's in terms of a reduction in farm output, so agricultural output. So that's basically how the Treasury generally thinks about natural disasters. That's number one. Number two is to do with what in Australia is called the disaster recovery payments. So again, how much money will we need to spend if there is a natural disaster? That's the extent of it. So there really is an opportunity for the central government in Australia, the federal government, Scott Morrison, Prime Minister, and Josh Frydenberg, the Treasurer, who used to be my boss, the Treasurer. So there is a real opportunity there for the federal government to take an active role in leading a whole of Australia response to natural disasters. And that really is something that's lacking. And that became self-evident during the 2019 summer bushfires this time last year, where there was all of this havoc being taking place on the east coast in Australia. So many thousands of hectares being burnt and lost to flora and fauna, and the systems in place in terms of the governance structures were really left wanting. So there was so many gaps in the way that the federal government stepped in or didn't step in, and there were clear problems there, which I think are definitely areas for improvement when it comes to natural disaster management in Australia.
Okay, thank you, Mahid. Any other questions? Happy to take any questions now. I see there's one in the box here. Question, please. Could you briefly explain how do you go about quantifying something intangible, social impacts of natural disasters, e.g. the cost and impact on mental health? So that's a really great question. Those are obviously out of that list of stuff that I talked about that we quantify. Those are the hardest to quantify. Australia is in somewhat of a lucky position that there is reasonably good data available to help us try to quantify these harder social cost items. So, for example, I believe the flooding case study, what we were able to do there was use a national survey. So this is called, what's it called? The HILDA, the HILDA survey. So it's a national survey that's been running for many years, and it asks a whole range of questions about people's lifestyle and their economic and social well-being. And it also happens to have a question around whether you've been affected by a natural disaster within the previous X amount of time. So what we were able to do was go look at a HILDA survey from before and after the floods in Brisbane, and to compare the rates of responses around alcohol use and mental well-being and domestic violence in that survey. And so we're able to identify, like from an economics point of view, if there's any economists, it's basically a difference in differences type analysis. We're able to identify the impact that event, the flooding, had on these social outcomes. We were then able to, so Hilda's obviously a sample of the population. So we're basically estimating an increase in the rate of this event, and we can apply that to the known population rate to come up with a number of people that would be affected, or an incremental number of people that would be affected by the natural disaster in the area in total. And then we have a whole range of analysis in Australia that attempts to put dollar values on different kind of health and mental conditions. Those are published by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. And so by putting all of that information together, we're able to come up with that estimate that you see there of the social costs. Obviously, you know, that's a really great approach. It's a little bit limited in that it does require all of that information to be available, which is the reason why some of those boxes were grayed out. And obviously that approach doesn't necessarily translate to other countries which might not have that information ready to go. But the general approach is fairly, you know, you can fairly portable around other countries as long as the information is there. We have a follow-up question. Building on Amanda's question, what policy recommendations have been put forth to decision makers in government to better safeguard households from the social impacts of natural disasters? So that's a good question. So as Nick was going through the kind of impact that this has had on policy making, if you see that Productivity Commission report actually ended up picking up a lot of the recommendations from our early research. So, you know, we say it's our research, but we're working with the Business Roundtable, who are leaders in business and community around Australia. So it's kind of putting our heads together and coming up with some ideas. But a lot of those were picked up by the Productivity Commission. Some of them have been put into practice. So around community, so I think around the social impact of natural disasters, that tends to line up with like community resilience most closely. And to be honest, that community resilience is not that well understood, at least in Australia. And so in order to be able to develop that community level resilience, an initial first step was really around understanding the resilience of different communities in Australia. And that work was, you know, generated and has been done now by the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC in Australia. So we now have some really great tools that let us see which communities are most vulnerable to natural disasters. And I think we could see this play out in the recent bushfires in 2019-20. Mahid and I were, I guess, lucky enough to pick up a piece of work with the federal government that, you know, delved into that question directly. Straight after the bushfires, they wanted to know, you know, which communities are, you know, most exposed to these bushfires in terms of, not in terms of like had the most area burnt, but which have the most, you know, well, maybe the least community capital to help sustain them through. And then the federal government wanted to line that up with, okay, what are the programs that have been put in place in each of those areas by the federal and state government and a little bit of the private sector? And what are the gaps? So I think if I look back at, you know, if I compare that reaction to what happened back in 2009 after the Victorian bushfires, it's a completely different world of approach to how to intervene, you know, in the month or so after a natural disaster. So I think if you follow those steps through, like our report, Productivity Commission, research done by Bushfire Natural Hazards CRC, and it's now having practical policy impacts, I think that's a really good chain of events there. But yeah, social impacts, there's a lot of work still to be done.
there's no more questions, I might ask a question.
Okay, I think Nick's going to ask us a question.
So one question that I think might be useful, considering hopefully we've got some people from other additional countries, would be considering we've identified an issue in Australia as being that resilience tends to be underplayed as opposed to mitigation or rebuilding. And I'd be interested for any thoughts or experiences from other countries and whether that's something that resonates in other jurisdictions.
Yeah, I think if people do have something to kick in there, that would be very interesting. I think I would also add on to what Nick was saying about how this translates to other countries. So a lot of what we've spoken about here relates very closely to the data that is kind of set out under the Sendai framework. So to the extent that if other countries are improving their alignment with the Sendai framework for data gathering, that should assist in being able to transport this framework around to other parts of the globe. I mean, in other work for the federal government, we looked at how Australia was doing on Sendai data, and I think, a solid B plus maybe is what we probably would say. So, again, it's a work in progress, but if there is progress being made there, it will help out in applying this framework more broadly. We're getting close to time, so maybe we might wrap it up. We've just got on the last slide there some contact details for us. So me, Eamon McGinn, Mahid, who you heard speaking first, and Nick, who was speaking there at the end. Feel free to get in touch with us via email. You can also look up the Deloitte Access Economics website. If you do a search for Deloitte Access Economics, you should get our website, so you can always come try and find us. And there is also I would direct you towards the Australian Business Roundtable for disaster resilience, their website, which is where those 5 reports are published. They're a great organisation, and yeah, the work they're doing is really a good example for what could be done elsewhere as well. But yeah, happy to hear from you later on, and thanks for listening in and asking those questions in the sidebar. It's been great.